My husband put a device in my purse and surprised me in the ACT. I'm having a mental breakdown. My husband caught me in the act with my affair partner. It's the worst thing that could happen. He tracked me with an air tag. I don't know what to do. I feel like my marriage is over. I need advice. Let me give you some background. My name is Ashley. I am a 29-year-old woman. I'm Ashley, I'm 29 and I've been married to James, who is 30. I've been married to James for about 3 years now. Looking back, I remember the first time we met. It was a crisp autumn evening, and I was new to the city, eager to explore. We met in a cozy cafe downtown, where the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. I spotted James sitting alone, absorbed in a book. There was something about him that caught my eye, a warmth in his smile, a twinkle in his eyes. I decided to take a chance and asked I was lucky enough to be able to join him at his table. He said yes, and that's how it all started. We met over cups of coffee and conversation in a simple cafe. James and I moved fast, and I can't help but grin at how quickly we fell for each other. It didn't take long after our first cafe date for us to realize we were head over heels in love. Our dates were filled with laughter, deep talks, and those looks that said more than words ever could. It felt like our connection grew stronger with each passing day. Moving in together was a big step, but it felt right. Waking up beside James every morning was like living in a fairy tale. A couple of years later, we stood before our friends and family exchanging vows and promising to love each other forever. Looking back, I'm grateful for the beautiful love story James and I have written together. It hasn't always been easy, but our love has stayed strong through it all. I just don't think our love is strong enough to survive this. After 3 years of marriage, I realized it was a mistake. Things were going well. Our sex life was active whenever James was home, which added excitement to our relationship. Our lifestyle was lavish, thanks to James's job. To everyone else, our marriage looked perfect. The only downside was that James was always busy. He worked long hours as a managing director in a big company, which meant he was hardly ever around. Meanwhile, I worked as a sales associate in a small store. I kept myself busy since we didn't really need the money. I enjoyed my job, not because we needed the money, but because it allowed me to connect with people. James was always busy with one thing or another, working hard to secure our future. We both wanted kids, but we decided to wait a few more years before trying, hoping to be in a better place before expanding our family. I started feeling really lonely. It got so overwhelming that I missed my husband a lot. I couldn't blame James because he was working so hard for us. In fact, I even felt guilty for feeling lonely, knowing he was busting his butt to take care of me as I dealt with feeling super lonely. I kept it all to myself. I didn't talk to my family or friends about it, and I found it hard to open up to James. It was like drowning in sadness with no way out. Then along came David. He was younger, 22, just starting out in life. The second I saw him, something clicked inside me. He had this magnetic, there was something about him that drew me in. I tried to ignore it, but there was just something about him that got to me. He was so easy to talk to, and his laugh was contagious. It felt like he could see right through me, like he knew I was feeling lonely. Before I knew it, I was crushing on him big time. Every time I saw David, I wanted more. I found myself looking for excuses to be around him, soaking up all the attention he gave me. It was like he became my escape from the loneliness that was. It was eating me up inside, but deep down I knew it was wrong. I felt guilty for even thinking about him like that. I knew I was risking everything I had with James, but when I was with David it was like nothing else mattered. I was stuck between staying loyal to my husband and giving in to the temptation of being with David. I felt torn. I knew I had to sort out the issues in my marriage, but with David in the picture it felt impossible to resist. Before I knew it, David and I were chatting non-stop. We became really close friends, even though we didn't have a lot in common. In fact, that made us even closer. We'd debate about stuff all the time, each of us trying to convince the other of our point of view. Eventually, we exchanged contact info and started texting outside of work. David became like a ray of sunshine, and in my otherwise gloomy world, he was a breath of fresh air. He had this knack for making me laugh and could turn even the worst day around. I found myself spending all my time outside of work chatting with him. I'd talk to him all day at work and then come home and keep chatting with him. It was like he was always there, brightening up my day. I was fully aware that what I was doing was wrong. I wasn't naive, that's for sure, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to stop myself. It was like David had this magnetic pull on me, drawing me in despite my better judgment. Every time I told myself I needed to stop, that this wasn't okay, I found myself unable to resist. It was like I was caught in his orbit, unable to break free. Looking back, it seems pretty foolish now. In hindsight, it all seems pretty foolish. The worst part was that David had a girlfriend and I was married. We knew we were crossing boundaries, but we kept convincing ourselves we were just friends. Before long, our friendship spilled over into our personal lives. We started hanging out outside of work, going to the pub, we'd go for walks in the park and grab food at restaurants. It was like I was single again, swept up in this whirlwind of excitement and forbidden desire. It's hard to deny how good it felt, almost intoxicating. The thrill of sneaking around and the excitement of being with someone new. It was like a rush, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Despite my conscience telling me it was wrong, I couldn't resist the allure of the forbidden. We'd initially agreed not to visit each other's homes, but we ended up breaking that rule. In the heat of the moment, we threw caution to the wind and hung out more at David's place. James had installed surveillance cameras in our house, and we both had access to the footage. I didn't want to risk getting caught if James decided to check the cameras, so I spent most of my time at David's apartment. It was nothing fancy, just a typical place for someone starting out in life. It was a nice change. Before we knew it, we were going from the luxury of our home to David's place after work. Sometimes we'd even go out at night. We were always careful not to be seen by anyone we knew, especially since David was in a relationship and I was married. Avoiding recognition saved us from potential awkward explanations if we were caught. So we were really careful about it. David invited me over to his place to watch a movie, which wasn't anything unusual for us. We often did that, made popcorn, watched movies and flirted a bit, but we always made sure not to cross any lines. However, this time felt different. James was going to be working overtime as usual, leaving me alone at home, so I agreed. Once I got to David's, we made popcorn, ordered food and settled in to watch the movie. Everything was going well until David suggested putting on a second movie, which was really intense with a lot of sex and nudity. The tension in the air between us was palpable, and before we knew it, we kissed. One thing led to another and before I knew it, we were in the bedroom having sex. I ended up cheating on my husband. The next morning, I woke up feeling horrified. I felt ashamed and terrified of what my husband might have thought. I'd spent the night at David's, but when I checked my phone I saw a text from him saying he was going to stay in the office until the afternoon. It was a huge relief to know he wasn't waiting for me at home. I quickly messaged him to say it was okay, and how much I missed him, but deep down I was filled with shame. I'd promised myself I swore I wouldn't cross any boundaries, yet I did exactly the opposite. I knew I needed to cut ties with David. Despite the strain in our relationship caused by my husband's busy schedule, I loved him dearly. David was just a temptation, a really bad one. He was young and had a girlfriend, while I was married trouble. I went home, cleaned up, changed and called in sick to work. I needed time to process what I had done because I knew it was very wrong. There was no way I could tell my husband. I knew he wouldn't forgive me for cheating. In all honesty, I wouldn't forgive him either if he had done the same thing. So what were the chances he would forgive me? David was more challenging than I anticipated when I returned to work the next day. He impressed me with his acting skills. He acted as if nothing had happened, being as nice as ever and even bringing me lunch. I was surprised. I expected things to be awkward, but David was playing it cool, going above and beyond to be extra. He was really nice to me. As soon as our shift ended, I made a quick exit to avoid any chance of him inviting me over again. But it seemed like David had read my mind because I received a text from him reassuring me not to worry. He said he'd give me a few days to cool down and that what happened was entirely his fault, not mine. He even went as far as to suggest that my husband's neglect was to blame. He reassured me that I had needs. To be honest, I craved validation more than anything. I needed someone or something to absolve me of the guilt that was weighing on my conscience. When David placed the blame squarely on himself, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Deep down, I knew I was at fault, but his words provided a temporary reprieve from the overwhelming guilt I felt. I felt relieved. I latched onto David's words, convincing myself that it wasn't my fault. I manipulated the situation in my mind, telling myself that I had needs as a woman and that my husband's neglect was to blame. Plus, I reassured myself that there was no chance of James ever finding out about David. It felt like I was in the clear, safe from the consequences of my actions. I convinced myself that what James didn't know wouldn't hurt him. I told myself that what James didn't know wouldn't hurt him, despite feeling guilty. I decided to keep my friendship with David because he was the only one who seemed to understand me. I sent David a text to thank him, and before long, our friendship was back to normal. Days passed, and we picked up where we left off. It was a relief to have things back to normal, at least on the surface. David soon made an unexpected offer. He suggested that we become friends with benefits. He assured me that we could keep it secret and neither his girlfriend nor my husband would ever find out. David was very persuasive, and despite my initial reluctance, I found myself. I thought about his offer. James would never find out about Reese. The odds were in my favor. I asked for some time to think it over, but I already felt like I was leaning towards agreeing. David's charm and persuasion were hard to resist. I couldn't shake the temptation of his offer. David also mentioned that I had really enjoyed our previous encounter and missed. He suggested we keep things going, and I found myself agreeing. He had one more request. He asked if I could help him out with some cash every now and then. I agreed, as long as it wasn't too much. I didn't want to have to explain to James what I had done with the money. And that's how it all began with David and me. It's kind of crazy to think about. How long did it last? Well, I felt guilty about it, but as I've said 100 times, I was lonely. I needed that connection. David and I would hang out at his place and be intimate. Of course, there were times when we couldn't meet up, like when his girlfriend was around or when James was home. But we had a pretty perfect schedule. After work, I'd clock off with David, and we'd head. When his girlfriend was around, I'd stay home and we'd chat. Sometimes, when James was home and I was missing David, I'd make up an excuse to go out just so I could see him. As time passed, James noticed something was off between us. He could see that I wasn't myself anymore, that my smiles weren't as genuine, and that my laughter felt forced. I didn't notice or care about the gap between us. I was too wrapped up in my own world. I could see the hurt in James' eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what was really going on. Whenever he asked, I'd just brush it off with a weak excuse. I was too caught up in my own guilt and desires. I knew I was doing something wrong, but I couldn't face the truth. The guilt weighed heavy on me. It was a reminder of the promises I had broken, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself to end things with David, I couldn't resist the temptation. It felt like I was stuck in a never-ending cycle of wanting and regret, unable to break free. I promised myself I'd fix things with James, but the pull of David's affection was too strong to resist. I was torn between my love for James and the excitement. I was caught up in my affair with David. No matter how much I wanted to break free, I was in too deep to turn back. As my affair with David carried on, I found myself slipping deeper into lies and deceit. It began innocently enough with David asking for small favors like borrowing some cash to cover expenses. I willingly obliged, thinking I was just helping out a friend. But as time passed, the requests kept coming and the amounts got larger. I felt guilty each time I handed over the money, but I convinced myself it was justified. I thought it was a way to ease David's financial struggles. But deep down, I knew I was using money to justify my affair and ease my conscience about betraying James. I became careless, leaving behind traces of my infidelity. I thought James would never suspect a thing. I grew comfortable. I was careless and sloppy in covering my tracks. I was convinced I was too clever to get caught. Months passed and my affair continued unchecked. I was oblivious to the growing distance between James and me. I was convinced he had no idea. However, James was starting to connect the dots. I didn't even know. This morning kicked off like any other. James and I had a chat before he headed to work. He said he'd swing by. Later on, he was going to get some stuff before heading back. He'd be home fully the next day, which meant I could see David. I'd been seeing David on the side for months now, convinced I was flying under the radar. Work went smoothly, and David was his usual charming self, bringing me lunch and coffee after work. We decided to continue our private time at his place. We were getting cozy when hunger struck, so we decided to get pizza, but when the delivery guy knocked, I ran to the door, thinking it was him. But it was James, not the pizza guy. I hadn't thought to check the peephole, and there I was, face to face with my husband. I was so embarrassed. I stood there, speechless. What could I say? I was wearing nothing but David's t-shirt. James didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked away, looking pretty disappointed. I started crying and begging him to let me explain, but he didn't listen. He left me standing there alone, and all I could do was cry, knowing I had destroyed our marriage. I was completely lost and overwhelmed. What should I do now? Being caught like that threw me into a panic, and I didn't know how to handle it. How did things get so messed up? I guess I got a bit careless, and now I'm paying the price. I'm still trying to figure out how James found out about David's place. There were only two ways he could have found out: either he tracked me somehow or he followed me. But I don't think he followed me without me noticing, so I'm left with the unsettling thought that he must have used some kind of tracking device, like an AirTag. Maybe I freaked out and told him. David, we searched for anything suspicious and finally found an AirTag hidden in my car. I didn't think of it sooner. James seemed calm and showed no signs of suspicion, which surprised me. I have to figure out how to confront him, but I'm scared and don't know what to say. I need advice. Can anyone help me through this mess? It's been a while since I hi everyone. I've been meaning to give you an update for a couple of months. I'm sure you remember me as the woman who came to you panicking and asking for advice because my husband had tracked me with an AirTag and found my affair partner's house. It was indeed an AirTag in my car. Fast forward 2 months and a lot has happened. David helped calm me down initially, but then he ended things abruptly. He said James's actions were a wake-up call. I got a call from him asking me to sort things out with his girlfriend. I couldn't believe it. After everything I'd done for him, he just walked away without a second thought. I'd given him money, time and affection, but I wasn't too torn up about it. I was actually planning on ending things with David anyway. My focus was on fixing things with James, but when I tried to talk to him after I got back, he wouldn't even listen. It was a devastating blow. When James wouldn't listen to any of my excuses, I tried to reason with him, but it felt like I was hitting a brick wall with David gone. I couldn't bear the thought of James leaving me too. I'd be completely lost. I realized how much I relied on James, both emotionally and financially. Without him, I'd be stranded. I'd be stuck where I'd end up, what I'd do. The fear of being alone without him was terrifying. I begged James to stay, but he remained firm. He said that if I'd felt guilty, I would have ended things with David a long time ago. Especially when James was trying his best to make our relationship work. His words stung. James said he had believed my absence was pushing me away. He was unaware of my affair with another guy. I kept on begging James, feeling desperate and scared. The idea of being left with nowhere to go, especially with my family living in another state, was daunting. But James wasn't sympathetic. He brushed off my worries, saying it wasn't his problem. James said he'd known about me and David for weeks. I felt like he'd punched me in the gut when he told me he'd suspected something fishy and had secretly planted the AirTag in the car to confirm his suspicions. He'd hoped I'd feel guilty and end things with David, but my actions proved him right. To make matters worse, James said he had screenshots of my messages with David. It was like a nightmare unfolding before my eyes. I'd been caught red, I was at a loss. There was no way out. James didn't hold back. He opened up about how he'd always felt like something was wrong between us. He thought my behavior, especially being glued to my phone, was driving us apart. He tried to ease up at work, hoping it would help. But it didn't. My behavior only fueled his suspicions. I was crying like a child and begging. James said he wanted to forgive me, but he wasn't having it. He said he tried to forgive me, but I'd betrayed him. I'd used his money to fund the affair. It was a crushing blow, but despite my pleas, James stayed firm. He said I'd lost him from the moment I stepped out of my marriage. James took my car keys and gave me a strict 10-minute deadline to pack. James gave me a minute to pack. He said I couldn't take any of the jewelry or expensive bags he'd bought me, despite my pleas. He stood firm, threatening to call security if I didn't move fast. I hurriedly packed, leaving behind the jewelry and most of the pricey bags to avoid upsetting James further. He'd also emptied our joint account, leaving me with there wasn't much cash left. He said I should call my family for help, even though they lived out of state. I knew I had to reach out to my family for support. James made it clear that the divorce was happening. That's the whole story. My family sent me money for a plane ticket, so I flew back to meet them. James said he'd contact me once. The divorce papers have been settled. I'm not sure how it'll go down in court, but my brother, who's a lawyer but can't represent me because of a conflict of interest and divorce isn't his area, thinks my chances of getting anything are slim. It's mainly because I cheated and we don't have kids together. My brother thinks James might not give me anything. I'll sign whatever divorce papers James brings because I cheated. I feel like it's fair punishment for hurting him, even if he doesn't want to give me a dime. I'll sign and move on peacefully. My family tried to help by staging an intervention, but James wouldn't let him in the house. He even said he'd call security. My friends and coworkers tried to help too. I also have to say that my colleagues aren't on my side. Some of them messaged me to say that they always knew my relationship with David seemed a bit dodgy. I blocked them all because I didn't need the negativity. I've been trying to keep a low profile, but now I have to start job hunting. I might have to crash at my folks' place because I can't afford rent on my own without James. I see how much I really need support. I'm flat broke. As for David, that scumbag hasn't reached out to me at all. Thanks for hearing me out.